The laughter was supposed to come easily that night. That's what everyone expected when Carol Burnett walked onto the Tonight Show stage in October 1981. She was America's sweetheart, the woman who'd spent 11 years making the country laugh every Saturday night. Her show had just ended its final season, and this appearance was meant to be celebratory. A victory lap, a fond farewell, a chance for Johnny and Carol to reminisce about the good times. But sometime between the commercial break and the question Johnny asked, something shifted. And what happened in the 47 seconds that followed would never be mentioned again. Not in any interview, not in any memoir, not in the carefully curated retrospectives that would celebrate both their careers for decades to come. The people in Studio One that night remember it differently than the viewers at home. Television has a way of smoothing things over, of making silences seem shorter than they are, of cutting away before discomfort becomes unbearable. But if you were sitting in those seats, watching two masters of their craft suddenly stripped of all performance, you remember. You remember the way Carol's smile didn't so much fade as collapse. You remember the way Johnny's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. You remember the sound of 300 people holding their breath at once. But to understand what broke in those 47 seconds, you have to understand what was already fracturing before Carol ever sat down in that guest chair. Part 1. The Architecture of Charm. October 1981. NBC Studios, Burbank, California. Johnny Carson sat at his desk, 23 minutes into the show, riding the momentum of a solid monologue and a first guest who'd been professional and forgettable in equal measure. The audience was warm. The band was tight. Everything was working the way it was supposed to work. Doc Severinson's trumpet punctuated the transition as the first guest exited. Ed McMahon settled back into his chair with that familiar, comfortable weight, ready to laugh at whatever came next. The cameras repositioned, the lights adjusted. Johnny glanced at his notes, 3 index cards with bullet points, conversation starters, safe territory. Carol Burnett was easy. She always had been. Funny, gracious, quick, a professional who understood the rhythm of late-night television better than almost anyone. They'd done this dance dozens of times over the years. "My next guest," Johnny said, his voice carrying that particular warmth that wasn't quite warmth but felt like it, "needs no introduction, but I'm going to give her one anyway because that's literally my job." The audience laughed. Johnny smiled. "She's spent the last 11 years making Saturday nights something special. She's been a guest on this show more times than I can count, and every single time she makes me look better than I deserve. Please welcome the brilliant Carol Burnett." The applause was immediate and genuine. Carol walked out, elegant in a burgundy dress, her posture perfect, her smile radiant. She waved to the audience with that characteristic Carol gesture, part royal wave, part humble acknowledgement. She hugged Johnny, kissed him on the cheek, settled into the guest chair with practiced ease. "Carol Burnett, ladies and gentlemen," Johnny said again, gesturing to her as the applause continued. "How does it feel to be unemployed?" "Liberating," Carol said, and the audience laughed. "I've been getting up at 5 in the morning for 11 years. Last Saturday I slept until noon. It was glorious." 11 years, Johnny repeated, leaning back in his chair. "That's longer than most marriages last in this town." "Longer than some of mine," Carol shot back, and the audience roared. This was the rhythm they knew. This was the performance they'd perfected over years of practice. Joke, response, laugh, transition. A perfectly calibrated machine designed to make 40 million people feel like they were eavesdropping on a conversation between old friends. But something in Carol's eyes wasn't matching her smile. Johnny saw it. He'd been reading faces across this desk for 19 years, and he knew the difference between someone who was tired and someone who was holding something back. Carol was doing both. The Carol Burnett show was... Johnny paused, choosing his words carefully. It was special. Not just funny. Special. How did you know when it was time to end it? Carol's smile shifted slightly. Still there, still professional, but the light behind it dimmed just a fraction. "You just know," she said. "You wake up one morning and realize you've done everything you set out to do. You've told all the stories, you've made all the memories, and if you keep going, you're just repeating yourself." "But you could have kept going," Johnny pressed gently. The ratings were still good. The audience still loved you. They did, Carol agreed. They do, and that's why I stopped. Better to leave when they still want more than to stay until they're relieved you're gone. The audience applauded this wisdom. Johnny nodded, made a note on his card. This was good material, thoughtful, substantive, the kind of conversation that made The Tonight Show feel important. So what's next? Johnny asked. Surely you're not just going to sleep until noon for the rest of your life. Why not? Carol said. I've earned it. Another laugh. But Johnny could see the tension in her shoulders now, the way her hands were gripping each other in her lap, just a little too tightly. He glanced at his next card, 3 bullet points. The third one said, Daughters, how are they handling the change? It was a standard question. Carol had 3 daughters, Carrie, Jody, and Erin. She talked about them sometimes in interviews, always with warmth and humor. It was safe territory. Personal, but not too personal. The kind of question that would lead to a funny anecdote about family life, maybe a story about one of the girls saying something precocious. Johnny looked at Carol, really looked, and in that moment he had a choice. He could skip the question, move to the next card, keep things light, or he could ask it, the way he'd asked 1,000 other questions, assuming the answer would be as polished and professional as everything else Carol Burnett had ever done on television. He asked it, How are your daughters handling all this? The show ending, you being home more? The smile on Carol's face didn't fade. That's what made it so terrible. The smile stayed exactly where it was, frozen, locked in place like a mask that couldn't be removed, even though everything behind it was collapsing. She opened her mouth to answer. Nothing came out. She closed it, opened it again. Still nothing. The silence lasted 3 seconds, then 5, then 7. In television time, 7 seconds is an eternity. The audience began to shift in their seats, uncertain whether this was part of the act or something else entirely. Doc Severinsen glanced at his band members. Ed McMahon leaned forward slightly, his face concerned. Johnny's hand, which had been reaching for his coffee cup, stopped moving. Carol? He said quietly. She was looking at him, but also through him, her eyes focused on something he couldn't see. Her hands, still gripped together in her lap, had gone completely white at the knuckles. She started, and her voice cracked. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make sense as performance. Just a small, human break in the sound. I'm sorry. She stopped again. Johnny set down his cards. The audience had gone completely silent now. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful but suffocating. The collective held breath of 300 people who don't know what they're witnessing. It's okay, Johnny said, and his voice was different now. Not the Tonight Show voice, not the professional host managing an awkward moment, just gentle, real. Take your time. Carol shook her head, a tiny movement, almost imperceptible. I can't, she whispered. I don't think I can talk about, and then she stopped trying. She just sat there, this woman who'd spent 11 years being brilliantly, professionally, consistently funny on live, able to speak. Her smile was still there, but it wasn't hiding anything anymore. It was just the last remaining piece of armor, and everyone could see it was broken. Johnny made a decision. He stood up. The cameras didn't know what to do with this. Neither did the director in the booth, who was frantically signaling for a commercial break that Johnny was ignoring. Johnny walked around his desk, something he almost never did during an interview, and sat on the edge of it, closer to Carol, blocking her from the main camera. Hey, he said quietly, just to her, though the microphones picked it up anyway. You don't have to say anything you don't want to say. Carol looked up at him, and her eyes were wet. Not crying, not yet, but close. I know, she said. When you asked about my daughters, I realized I don't know how to answer that question without lying. And I'm so tired of lying, Johnny. I'm so tired. The audience couldn't fully hear this. The microphones weren't positioned right, and Carol's voice was too soft. But they could see Johnny's face, and what they saw there was something they'd never seen before. Johnny Carson, the master of control, the king of composure, looking genuinely uncertain about what to do next. He glanced toward the wings, toward Fred de Cordova, his producer. Fred was making a cutting motion across his throat. Go to commercial, end this, save her from herself. Johnny looked back at Carol. Do you want to stop? He asked. We can cut to commercial right now. Nobody has to know. No, Carol said, and her voice was stronger now. No. She took a breath. Another. Carrie is struggling. My oldest daughter, she's 21 and she's struggling with things I don't know how to help her with. And I've been so focused on the show, on keeping everything perfect and professional and funny, that I didn't see how bad it had gotten until... She stopped, swallowed hard. Until it was almost too late, she finished. The studio was so quiet you could hear the lights humming. Johnny sat there, perched on the edge of his desk, and for once in his career, he had no joke to diffuse the tension, no smooth transition to lighter topics. He just had this moment, this raw, unscripted, impossible moment, and a woman who just told 40 million people something real. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I didn't know. I wouldn't have. You couldn't have known." Carol interrupted. "Nobody knows. That's the whole point. We're all so good at pretending everything's fine. You sit in that chair every night and pretend. I stood on that stage every Saturday and pretended, and the pretending works until it doesn't." She looked directly at the camera now, as if suddenly remembering it was there. "My daughter is an addict," she said, and her voice was steady now, clear. "She's 21 years old, and she's addicted to drugs, and I don't know if I can save her. I don't even know if it's my job to save her. But I know that I can't sit here and do another interview where I smile and tell funny stories and pretend that everything in my life is as perfect as it looks on television." Part 2. The weight of what's real. The commercial break came 30 seconds later, but it felt like 30 years. Fred de Cordova appeared from the wings, moving fast, already talking into his headset about damage control and legal implications and whether they could cut the segment entirely. But Johnny waved him away, still sitting on the edge of his desk, still focused entirely on Carol. "Are you okay?" he asked. Carol laughed, a small broken sound. "I have no idea. Do you want to continue? We can end the interview right now. I'll do a monologue, fill the time." "What would you say about me?" "Nothing. I'd talk about politics or Ed's drinking problem." "Hey," Ed protested from his chair, and it broke the tension just enough for Carol to breathe. "No," she said. "No, if I stop now, if I walk off, then that's all anyone will remember. Carol Burnett had a breakdown on The Tonight Show. I need to." She paused, searching for words. "I need to finish what I started." Johnny studied her face. "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure about anything anymore," Carol said. "But I know I'm tired of pretending, so let's not pretend." The cameras came back on 40 seconds later. Johnny had returned to his chair. Carol had composed herself, not back to the professional polish she'd walked out with, but to something more stable, more present. "Welcome back," Johnny said to the camera, and his voice carried a weight it hadn't had before. "We're here with Carol Burnett, and we're having a conversation that's..." He paused. "Well, it's more honest than most conversations that happen on this show. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or stay silent. They chose silence. Carol just told us something personal," Johnny continued, "something painful, and I think..." He looked at her. "I think she did it because she's brave, and because she knows there are people watching who might need to hear it." Carol nodded. "There are a lot of families dealing with addiction, a lot of parents who don't know what to do, who feel like they failed, who are ashamed to talk about it because it doesn't fit the image we're all supposed to maintain." "The image of the perfect family," Johnny said. "The image of the perfect anything," Carol corrected. "Perfect career, perfect life, perfect control over everything that's happening to us." She looked at Johnny with something that might have been understanding. "You know about that, don't you? About maintaining the image?" It was a challenge, gentle but direct. And Johnny, who'd spent 19 years deflecting personal questions, who'd built an entire career on the foundation of never quite letting anyone in, had a choice to make. He could laugh it off, make a joke, redirect, or he could meet her where she was standing. "I do," he said quietly. "I know exactly what you're talking about." The audience was absolutely still. "I've been doing this show for 19 years, Johnny continued. 5 shows a week, almost every week. And in that time, I've interviewed thousands of people, told tens of thousands of jokes, and I've been very careful never to let anyone see behind the curtain, because that's not what this is for. This is entertainment. This is escape. People don't tune in to The Tonight Show to hear about my problems or my doubts or the things that keep me up at 3 in the morning. But maybe they should, Carol said. Johnny looked at her for a long moment. Maybe, he admitted. But I don't know if I know how to be that person on camera, the real person. I've been the character for so long. The character is easier, Carol said. The character doesn't hurt. No, Johnny agreed. The character doesn't hurt. They sat there, two people who'd spent decades mastering the art of public performance, suddenly confronting the cost of that mastery on live television. Ed McMahon, watching from his chair, felt something he'd never quite felt before during a taping, the sense that he was intruding on something private, that everyone watching was intruding, but also that this intrusion was necessary, somehow, important. When I decided to end my show, Carol said, everyone asked me what I was going to do next, what projects I had lined up, like the idea of just stopping, just being still for a moment was unacceptable. But I needed to stop. I needed to be present for my daughters in a way I haven't been, in a way I couldn't be while I was trying to be Carol Burnett, America's sweetheart, every Saturday night. Do you think you can? Johnny asked. Be present, I mean, after years of being the character? I don't know, Carol said honestly, but I have to try, because Carrie needs her mother, not her mother's public persona. She needs someone who's willing to sit with her in the hard moments, not someone who's trying to turn every hard moment into material for next week's show. Johnny picked up his coffee cup, realized it was empty, set it back down. How is she now, Carrie? She's in treatment, Carol said. A good facility. She's trying. Some days are better than others, but she's trying, and I'm trying to support her without trying to fix her. That's the hardest part, accepting that I can't make this funny. I can't perform my way out of it. No, Johnny said. Some things can't be performed away. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was contemplative. The audience seemed to understand that they were watching something rare, not entertainment, but communion. Two people choosing, in a space designed for artifice, to be briefly, uncomfortably real. I'm going to get letters, Carol said, and there was a hint of her humor returning, rueful and self-aware. People are going to think I used your show to air my dirty laundry. Let them think that, Johnny said. Or let them think you used my show to tell the truth, which would actually be a first. Carol smiled, a real smile this time, small but genuine. You do it sometimes. Tell the truth. I've seen it. Those moments when you forget to be Johnny Carson and you're just you. Those moments are accidents, Johnny said. Maybe they shouldn't be. Part 3, the conversation they couldn't have. The interview continued for another 11 minutes. They talked about Carol's plans for the future. Vague, uncertain, honest. They talked about the pressure of live television, the weight of audience expectations, the strange isolation of being famous. They didn't tell jokes. They didn't perform. And the audience, both in the studio and at home, stayed with them. The ratings for that segment would be analyzed later, and the executives would be surprised to find that viewership actually increased during those final 11 minutes. People didn't tune out when the entertainment stopped. They leaned in. When Carol finally stood to leave, Johnny stood with her. He hugged her, not the quick performative hug that guests always got, but a real embrace, sustained and meaningful. Thank you, she whispered, too quiet for the microphones. For what? Johnny asked. For not trying to fix it, for not making it okay, for just being here. Johnny nodded. He understood. The audience applauded as Carol walked off stage, and the applause had a different quality than usual. Not excited, not entertained, but respectful, acknowledging. Johnny returned to his desk, sat down, and looked at the camera. For a long moment, he said nothing. The director in the booth was frantically signaling, say something, transition, introduce the next segment, but Johnny ignored him. Sometimes, Johnny said finally, television can be something more than just entertainment. Sometimes it can be honest, and that's scary because honesty is messy and uncomfortable, and it doesn't always wrap up neatly in the time between commercial breaks. But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's important. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Carol Burnett just did something brave. She told you about her daughter, about her struggle, about the fact that her life isn't as perfect as it appears to be. And I want you to know, if you're watching this, if you're dealing with addiction in your family, If you're struggling with something you think you're supposed to hide, you're not alone. And maybe the bravest thing we can do is stop pretending we have it all figured out. He picked up his notes, glanced at them, set them aside. "We're going to take another commercial break," he said. "And when we come back, I'm going to interview a comedian who's going to tell jokes and make you laugh. And that's okay too. We need laughter. We need escape. But maybe we also need this. Maybe we need both." The cameras cut, the red lights dimmed, and Johnny Carson sat at his desk, surrounded by the machinery of entertainment, wondering if he'd just made a terrible mistake or the first real choice he'd made in years. Part 4. What the cameras didn't show. The show ended at 1 in the morning. Johnny did his golf swing, the audience applauded, and the curtain closed on what should have been a routine Thursday night. But backstage in the hallways and dressing rooms, the atmosphere was different. Crew members spoke in hushed voices. Producers gathered in small groups, uncertain whether to celebrate or panic. No one could quite name what had happened, but everyone knew it was significant. Fred de Cordova found Johnny in his dressing room 20 minutes after the show ended. Johnny was still in his suit, still camera-ready, staring at nothing. "Well," Fred said, "that was something." "Are they going to fire me?" Johnny asked. "For what? Having an honest conversation? Being human on television?" Fred sat down heavily. "The phones are ringing off the hook. Affiliates, sponsors, executives. Nobody knows what to make of it. Good or bad? Both. Some people think it was inappropriate. Some people think it was the most important thing we've ever broadcast." Fred paused. "I think it was both." Johnny was quiet for a moment. "I didn't plan it. The moment just happened, and I couldn't figure out how to get back to the script." "Maybe you shouldn't have gotten back to the script. This is the Tonight Show, Fred. The script is all we have." "Is it?" Fred leaned forward. "Johnny, I've been producing this show for 12 years, and tonight was the first time I felt like I was watching something that mattered. Not just entertainment, not just distraction, something real." "Real doesn't sell advertising," Johnny said. "Maybe it should." They sat in silence for a while, two men who'd spent years building the machine of late-night television, suddenly uncertain whether the machine was enough. "Carol called," Fred said finally. "She wanted to make sure you were okay." "Is she okay?" "I think so. Scared about what comes next, but okay." Fred stood to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing tonight. You gave her space to be honest, and you were honest back. That's rare. On television, that's almost miraculous." After Fred left, Johnny sat alone with his thoughts. He thought about Carol's face when she couldn't answer his question. He thought about his own admission that he didn't know how to be real on camera anymore. He thought about the audience's silence, that suffocating, necessary silence. And he thought about tomorrow night, when he'd be back in that chair, back in the script, back in the character he'd been playing for 19 years. Would anything be different? Could anything be different? He didn't know. But for 47 seconds, he'd been present in his own life instead of performing it. He'd met another human being in their pain instead of deflecting it with humor. He'd chosen truth over comfort. And even if he never chose it again, even if tomorrow night he was back to jokes and smooth transitions and carefully maintained distance, he'd know. He'd remember what it felt like to let the mask slip. To be vulnerable on a stage designed for invulnerability. Carol had given him that gift, and he'd given it back to her. That had to mean something. Epilogue. The calls that came after. The network didn't fire Johnny Carson. They couldn't. He was the Tonight Show, and the show was him. But there were meetings, carefully worded memos about maintaining appropriate boundaries, about the difference between authenticity and therapy, about the network's responsibility to its advertisers and sponsors. Johnny listened, nodded, agreed to nothing. The next night, he opened the show with his usual monologue. Politics, Hollywood gossip, safe material. The audience laughed in all the right places. Everything was back to normal. But there was a moment, just before the first commercial break, when Johnny looked directly at the camera and said, "If you or someone you love is struggling with addiction, there are people who can help. You don't have to face it alone." It was 15 seconds, a tiny crack in the facade. But it was there. The calls started that night. Not to the network. They'd prepared for complaints, for controversy, for backlash. Instead, the calls went to addiction hotlines, to treatment centers, to support groups. Thousands of calls from people who'd watched Carol Burnett sit in that guest chair and choose honesty over image, who'd seen Johnny Carson respond with gentleness instead of jokes. People who'd realized they didn't have to pretend anymore. Carol's daughter, Carrie, would struggle for years. The path to recovery isn't linear, isn't simple, isn't solved by a single honest conversation on late-night television. But Carol's willingness to speak publicly about her daughter's addiction, to admit that her life wasn't perfect, opened a door for other families, made space for conversations that had been happening in shame and silence. Years later, after Johnny had retired, after Carol had returned to work and then retired again herself, they would see each other at industry events. They never talked about that night directly. But there was an understanding between them, a recognition of what they'd shared in those 47 seconds of silence. They'd stopped performing, they'd been real. And for both of them, it had changed something fundamental about how they understood their work, their lives, their responsibility to the people who watched them. The footage still exists. Unlike the gun incident that allegedly happened with Marcus Webb, this moment was never suppressed, never locked away. It aired. It's been referenced in documentaries, in retrospectives, in think pieces about the evolution of late-night television. But most people don't remember it. It's been overshadowed by bigger moments, by more dramatic interviews, by the carefully curated highlight reels of both their careers. The people who remember are the ones who needed it, the parents who called treatment centers that night, the families who started having honest conversations about addiction, the viewers who realized that the people they saw on television weren't as different from them as they seemed. And Johnny and Carol, they remembered. Because for 47 seconds, in a space designed for artifice, they chose to be human. They chose to be present. They chose to acknowledge that beneath the performance, beneath the characters they'd created, there were real people with real struggles. And that choice, that brief, terrifying, necessary choice, mattered more than any joke, any laugh, any perfect execution of the script. It was real. And real, in a place like that, is the rarest thing of all.